Hey guys, David Wills here with TED-IELTS.com, and today I'm going to be showing you very quickly how to write the perfect Task 1 line graph description for IELTS. So here we have a line graph, very simple, about population growth in two countries, that's India and China. So we can look at it and it's pretty easy to understand. I think there's nothing really complicated there. It's simply showing the population over a period of time from the year 2000 to 2050. There's nothing extra, there's nothing difficult there to follow. So what year is it now? Well, it's the year 2019. That puts us about here. Anything, therefore, that comes after this point, such as 2020, 2030, and so on, we're going to have to use different language to describe. Anything that was in the past, we can refer to our past tenses. Anything that comes in the future, we'll use a future tense, or we'll use some hypothetical expression. So what do we do first when we see this kind of task? Well, first things first, you should read the instructions here for IELTS Task 1. It's always going to be pretty much the same, but you've got this sentence in the middle here that you should read. It'll give you some important information that usually refers to the title at the top of the graph. So here, the graph below shows population figures for India and China since the year 2000 and predicted population growth up until 2050. So we need to paraphrase this to begin. Paraphrase means to say the same thing in a new way. You don't want to copy the question. In fact, that's a big problem. If you were to copy the question, let's say it's 25 words, and then you went and wrote 150 words, the examiner will deduct those 25 words from your score, giving you just a total of 125 words. This would cost you severely when the examiner is marking your essay. So what can we say to begin? Okay, so here are two sentences we can use to introduce. Now in the question it says the graph below. I've written the line graph shows. So I've changed graph to line graph, and of course I don't say below because you will have one piece of paper for you to write on and one piece of paper with the question on. The question will be above the data, and so it is above, so they say below. Your paper is going to have no graph below it, so you should not say below. So I've changed population figures to data about the population. I've changed India and China to two countries, comma, India and China. And I've changed this phrase here, since the year 2000 and predicted until 2050 to over a period of 50 years. Then I started a new sentence. It begins in 2000 and shows predicted population figures for the year 2050. Now notice that I'm using the present simple here. It begins because I'm just describing the line graph that is on this piece of paper. When I look at this piece of paper, I can talk about it in the present simple. When I actually start talking about the populations of these two countries, the real data, I'll start using past tenses, such as the past simple. What do I want to do next? Well, I've got these two sentences. That's a great start. So what I should do now is identify an overall trend. So I've identified two things that I think are main trends here. Perhaps I don't need to do them both, but I thought they were both quite obvious. One is the fact that both countries experience population growth. As you can see, the start and end for India, the start and end for China are both, the end is higher than the start. I've mentioned, of course, that India overtakes China, so India starts much lower and finishes much higher. And I've mentioned that China's population peaks, that means to reach the highest point, and then rolls back before the end of the period. So it peaks around here and then falls back slightly to finish at around 1.4 billion. Now I'm going to move into the next section. I'm going to write some actual details about this. To do this, I need to pay close attention to the years along the bottom, as well as the total populations at the top or on the left here. This is in billions. I think there's a mistake in this chart because India's population is currently over 1 billion, and so is China's. I think China's at about 1.37 billion now. This suggests 1.6 billion, 1.5 billion. I guess this should say million. I got this chart from one of my students who I guess found it here at this website. In any case, I'm going to go with the real figures rather than what the chart shows, and I'm going to assume that this was meant to say million. You sometimes see in IELTS line graphs, it will have a complicated way of expressing something. It would say 1,600 billion, which you would then have to change to 1.6 trillion, or 1,600 million, which becomes 1.6 billion. But there certainly are not, let's say, 1.6 trillion Indian people in the world. So I'm going to start off by commenting on the very first year. I think that's a very logical thing to do. You don't need to comment on every subsequent year, but it is sensible to start at the beginning. You'll notice that I wrote here 1 billion, and I typed the numeral 1 like this, and then I typed out ONE. When you use small numbers or simple numbers, ones that are easy to spell, it is a good idea to write them out like this. You'll notice that if you have too many numbers, for example, like this, littered through your essay, it doesn't look so good. It's a little too heavy on the numbers. Remember that this is a test of your English ability, and even just writing out the word one can make your English look a little better. So next, I have given a pretty basic description of what happens over a period of 30 years. Because, to be honest, there's not much point in describing this section here because there's nothing terribly exciting happening. It will be worth mentioning that China's population grows more slowly than India's, but we can perhaps do that later. Instead, we're going to jump forward to the next point that is worth noting, which is this crossover here. And what I've said is that it is predicted that they will trade places in about 2030. Notice how I switch from both countries' populations increased quite rapidly. So I'm talking about the past, and then within the same sentence, and it is predicted that they will trade places in about 2030. So I've moved into they will trade, so talking in the future tense. So as I said, I'm going to get into talking about the finer details and mention that China's growth was a little slower than that of India. You can see India's very steep growth here. China also quite fast, but not as fast as India. Then I'm going to talk about the peak. So after peaking at 1.45 billion, which is around here, now it's hard to identify the peak. You can see there are several points on this line graph that refer more or less to a similar point. So what I'll do is I'll add this. I'll say after peaking at 1.45 billion and leveling out for about a decade. So I figure this is a period of about a decade in here. A decade means 10 years, by the way. It will fall back to 1.4 billion by 2050. Now that's kind of what I said up here. I'm sort of repeating myself, but I'm using different words. It's okay to do that as long as you don't repeat yourself often. I said rolling back and will fall back, an end of period, and by 2050. Okay, so I've started a new paragraph here, and I've decided to talk about India to shift the focus away from China. I've already pretty much described China's trend here. Now talking about India, I'm going to talk about how it was much more rapid growth than that of China. So I say experienced because we're talking about this first part, which was in the past. And I then switch over to the future. It is not expected to slow until much later. So that is referring to here, although I didn't give any specific details, so I'll write another sentence. According to the graph, it will be around 2035 that India's explosive population growth will begin to slow. So that's up around here, 2035. And you can kind of see this trend slowing down a little bit after this really, really fast growth up until then. Notice again, it will be, so we're talking in our future tenses. Finally, the last thing is just to mention at the end here, it is expected that by 2050, the country will have around 1.6 billion people. Okay, so 1.6 billion people up here at the top, and this is by 2050 at the end. Now I could talk about the difference between these. I could go on and write another sentence saying that is 0.2 billion or 200 million people more than China. But if we look here, I've already written 192 words, which is more than enough. For IELTS writing task 1, you really ought to be writing just 160 to 180 words. Because I'm a native speaker and I'm an IELTS teacher, I can write a little bit more because I'm writing very fast and I'm very skillful at doing this. But you don't want to write too much. I actually wrote an article recently about why that is. I'll put the link down below. This sample Band 9 answer, this is something that I write for each and every one of my students who sign up for my writing correction service. I'll put the link in the description down below. It's very affordable and it's very fast and it's pretty much the best way to improve your IELTS writing skills. So why don't you take a look at that and check back next time for another video. It's been a pleasure. I'm David Wills. This is TED-IELTS.com. Goodbye.